Now let me introduce you to our first panelist. Madison Steffey is a recent graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School. She received a certificate in animal law, was on the Animal Law Review all 3 years, and served as external projects chair and then as co-director of Lewis and Clark's Animal Legal Defense Fund chapter. Madison wrote two papers on the topic of marine mammals in captivity during her studies and continues to focus on different strategies and campaigns on getting marine mammals free. Thank you so much for speaking for us today, Madison, and I am turning it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much.
Okay.
All right, let me share my screen. All right, can you all see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Great. So like Lou said, I'm a graduate from Lewis and Clark Law School. I focused almost entirely on the animal law program. It was my #1 choice for going there because I wanted to study animal law. I specifically wanted to do animal law because I learned about Lolita, who is a captive killer whale in Miami, Florida. And she's been there for over 50 years now. So after looking at everything, I realized the law was kind of the only really effective way I could try to help get her out of there. So I decided to go to law school. So I'll be talking about the detrimental effects of captivity on marine mammals. Here's an overview. I'll discuss all the different kinds of marine mammals that are in captivity, and then compare their captive lives to their wild lives to really highlight how it's harmful. And then I'll have a case highlight on Lolita, of course, and briefly go over the laws that are designed to protect marine mammals in captivity here in America. And then attempts at change and reform. So going over campaigns and advocacy that we can do to try to make things better for them. So, whales, dolphins, polar bears, sea lions, other pinnipeds like walruses, manatees, those are the most common marine mammals in captivity. There's others like beluga whales and other types of dolphins. And then I would say polar bears and killer whales are probably the ones that suffer the most because they're very complex, same with bottlenose dolphins. So I'll be focusing mainly entirely on killer whales just because they are the most studied of all these animals. Not only do we have so much research on them in the wild, but also in captivity since they've been around for so long. They also exhibit signs of the harm that captivity causes them very obviously. So they're a great model to look at when you're considering the effects of captivity on marine mammals. So let's get into this. So taking whales out of the ocean and into a tank on land basically goes against their entire nature. Whales' entire telos, or their purpose, requires them to be in the ocean. They're literally constantly moving, even while they're sleeping. So to put them in a tank completely devoid of everything that makes them a whale, foraging, socializing, traveling, feeling the magnetic poles of the earth, going through the ocean, the different temperatures, saltiness, depths, it's inherently cruel to deprive them of all of that. And that's what you're doing by putting them into a tank. And they're not able to fully adapt, even though we have some that are 50 years old or more and they've lived their entire lives in captivity at this point, it doesn't mean they're living fulfilling lives or that they're content. It just means they've survived in there. So here on this slide, you can see Shemek. He's a lone killer whale in Argentina. He's been there, I believe, since the 90s. And this is a holding tank in the back. So his performing tank is a little bit bigger, but not by much. And most of the time, these whales, they don't spend their time in the performing tank unless they're performing. So a lot of his time is spent in this teeny tiny little tank. And then in the center, that's Morgan. She was actually a rescued whale. She was, I believe, just a calf when she was rescued. And they took her in, and then, of course, they found a way to say, no, we need to hold on to her permanently. They claim that she's deaf and therefore they couldn't release her back into the wild. So now she lives at Laurel Park in Spain. And it's one of the, I would say, one of the worst facilities for orcas, just because the pod that they have there is so aggressive. And all those little red circles are highlighting the rake marks that she experiences. The whales, constantly attack each other. And then on the side there, it's a little gory, but I think it's necessary to see just how badly captivity can be for some of these animals. That's Candu. She was a orca at SeaWorld, and she lived with Corky, another female orca. And they kind of fought a lot. They were always trying to assert dominance over each other. And one day, Candu rammed Corky with her mouth open. It fractured her jaw, and she severed an artery, and she bled out. And the worst part was her calf was next to her, and had to watch her bleed out for 45 minutes. There was nothing the trainers or anyone could do at that point. I'll discuss captivity and how it's detrimental by comparing the stark differences of their captive lives and then how they live in the wild. And one of the most important and essential elements of an orca's life is their family structure. And in captivity, basically everything about their family or their pod is artificial. So in the wild, they form incredibly tight-knit units. They even have very specific dialects that they only speak to each other in that pod. And they live matriarchal societies. So the oldest female, she is the leader of the pod. She teaches everyone in the pod, her sons and daughters, her grandchildren, everything they need to know to survive. Like where to hunt, where to travel to hunt to find specific prey during the year, how to socialize, everything to make sure that they survive. And actually, orcas are one of the handfuls of mammals besides humans that actually experience menopause. And they scientists recently discovered that they believe this is because the grandmothers help their pods survive. So they live this long because the grandmothers are completely necessary to the pods. And then they can pass down all that vital information they have about hunting and socializing, where they live, how to find certain prey. They live this long so that they can pass it down to their family so that they can survive as long as possible. And it was actually stated that orca calves are more likely to survive past the crucial 2-year weaning mark if they have grandmothers. And obviously in captivity, they don't have this at all. It is a hodgepodge of every which way you can throw a killer whale into a pool. You have the original whales that were captured. So you have wild whales who were forced into captivity. And like I said, these whales come from different pods. They speak almost entirely different languages. So you have that mix, and now you have captive bred whales in there. So you have hybrids of different ecotypes of orcas, hybrids of captive born, wild born, and then all these, in the wild, the animals know what to do. They socialize with other pods, they find their mates and they breed. But in captivity, that's just not how it is, because they're not a family unit. There's not different families within that social structure. So most of them are bred through artificial insemination. And even inbreeding is typical because, right now, especially since SeaWorld has stopped breeding, there's only so many captive orcas anymore. SeaWorld has a huge breeding program, and they only have so many that they can choose from to impregnate their females. And then also, SeaWorld especially has bred their orcas very young. In the wild, orca females usually reach sexual maturity around 15 years old and males around 20. As you can see here, Katina was impregnated at 6 years old, which is egregious. And in the wild, most of the pods, sons and daughters will, leave, they'll go find mates, start their own families, but in a lot of pods, they actually stay with their family for life. And SeaWorld has gotten a lot of heat for separating their moms and calves. That's just not something that's normal, especially when they're babies. That 2-year period is incredibly important, but SeaWorld has been known to separate moms and calves, especially during that crucial time period. And they give a lot of excuses that, oh, there were other whales that were aggressive, or the social dynamics weren't working, but it doesn't matter. The babies need to be with their moms for at least 2 years. Um, and then SeaWorld also loves to throw out that their whales live pretty long, considering they do. A lot of them are close to, the lifespan that they'll reach in the wild. There's 2 older females, the oldest, Corky and Tokate, who is Lolita. They're around 55 years old, but then most of them after that are in their 20s and 30s, and then the newborns that they bred over the last few years. But in the wild, females can live up to 100 years old. They still believe that Lolita's mom is out there, and she has to be, I think, like 103 right now. But the average is 50, and then males 30. But there's been a lot of males that they've documented who are much older than that. But the point of the matter is, it doesn't matter if the orcas are living as long in captivity, they're not living great lives. And the only reason they're alive that long is because the facilities and trainers have to do everything they can to make sure they survive in those conditions. So a lot of the times they're medicated. I mean, they're fed vitamins, supplements, all sorts of things. A lot of people say, oh, well, the trainers, they love these animals. Like they love them like they're their own children, but like they have to, they have to care for them like that. Otherwise they wouldn't have made it as long as they have. I also just wanted to point out that in captivity, there's been a lot of cases of mothers rejecting their calves, and that's another thing that would rarely happen in the wild. So it's a really dysfunctional mess in captivity compared to the wild, and it's so essential to their well-being, especially with the grandmothers and the matriarchal society. The fact that they're not getting that in captivity kind of spills out this entire mess that they suffer, with aggression and stress. It just adds to it completely. And then the second most important element is the environment, obviously. A recent scientific article actually came out describing how captivity and sterile environments physically damage cetacean brains. So there's been evidence of capillaries shrinking, dendrite branches decreasing in length, and the thinning of the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex helps with cognition, memory, and planning. And Dr. Lori Marino, she's actually a cetacean neurologist, and she's the founder of the Whale Sanctuary Project. She explained that this brain damage, which is what it is a direct result of too much cortisol from the sterile environments, because they're not getting the exercise that they need, and they don't have any stimuli, and no true stimuli like they would get in the wild. So it leads to extreme boredom. And I think something she said is so important and poignant. She said, captivity is the chronic removal of choice. It's created learned helplessness, which affects the brain's ability to process emotions and memory, leading to stereotypic behaviors. Their life in the wild, they're making choices every minute to survive and to live their lives and to make choices with purpose. But in the wild, they have no reason to be using those tools that they have, because they're not faced with any of the stuff they would face in the wild. Everything's handed to them. They're not stimulated in any way. So in the wild, they're never bored. They're constantly stimulated through play and socialization with each other, hunting, traveling, diving far distances, and interacting directly with their environment, like beach rubbing, playing with kelp, other animals, and hunting real fish or marine mammals, depending on what kind of ecotype they are. And like I said, they always have a choice in the wild. They're biologically designed to make these decisions throughout their day. And most importantly, all those biological functions work in nature. I mean, specifically echolocation, that's how they live their lives. They use echolocation to hunt, communicate with each other, navigate and explore their surroundings. And like I said, different pods have different dialects, so they're only communicating with each other with their special language. and they can't do that in captivity. In captivity, they're forced to live not only with incompatible species, so a lot of the solo killer whales, they live with dolphins. They don't have any companionship with other orcas. And then, like I described earlier, they are forced to live with other orcas that they just don't get along with, that they're struggling with that dynamic of trying to be the dominant whale. Maybe it's a factor because they can't really communicate with each other because they're from different pods. No one really knows the extent of that, but the worst part of captivity in their environment is that they can't escape aggressive individuals or dangerous situations like Candu and Corky. There was no escape for Corky. You know, if Corky and Candu were in the wild, Candu may not have attacked her. She could have just gone off and removed herself from that situation. Same with Corky. They also just have no stimulation, like I said. Their tanks are barren. You can see at the bottom there at SeaWorld, it looks like they're in someone's basement that is filled with water. It's literally cement. They don't have vegetation. They don't have rocks. They don't have anything. I mean, the least these facilities could do is fill their tanks with something that's natural. They lack proper shade a lot of the times because a lot of these facilities obviously focus on the guests. So the stands where the guests are shaded, but there's no shading over the actual pools. They can't echolocate. They have no reason to. They lose purpose in their life because they aren't physically able to do all these essential things that they're supposed to be doing in the wild. It's really depressing, honestly. All right. And then I think you can see the culmination of how stripped down their lives are in captivity just by looking at their daily life compared to their wild counterparts. So we'll look at that here. As Dr. Marino said, whales are constantly bored in captivity and spend incredible amounts of time at the surface when they would never do that in the wild. In the wild, they only spend 10 to 20% of their time at the surface. And when they are at the surface, it's for a very specific purpose. You know, in captivity, they don't really have anything else to do. So when they're not doing shows or doing one-on-one time with a trainer, maybe interacting with each other, they're just maybe swimming in circles or logging at the top of the surface. They're only able to travel the circumference of their pool and they log at the surface otherwise. The only true stimulation is their shows throughout the day, but even then, a lot of the times, depending on the orca's behavior during that day, the trainer may not pull them out for the show, or they may only participate in one show. So that's maybe an hour of real stimulation where they're actually exercising and using their minds, you know, for a 24-hour day in and day out for the rest of their lives. An hour is not much. And this leads to the stereotypic behaviors I was talking about before. It's strictly due to boredom and an inability to fulfill their biological needs. So you'll see this a lot. They'll chew on the gates that separate their pools. They'll chew on the concrete. And sorry, just checking my notes so I make sure I get everything. And then also the aggression is probably also linked to stereotypic behavior because they don't have anything else to do. They have these other whales in there that they may or may not get along with. So all that builds up and there's nowhere to go. And the gate and wall chewing is actually a really serious problem. It's literally damaging their teeth. So they've actually started practicing drilling their teeth, which you can see in these photos. When the teeth break, they have to drill them to clear all out so that they won't get an infection. It's kind of like a root canal in humans, except in humans, you get it filled and capped. And the orcas in captivity, they just have to flush them every day with chemicals so that they don't get an infection. You know, also they don't get, like I said, they don't eat real fish. They don't even have fish in there to play with, a live fish to play with or eat. None of their food is programmed to what kind of ecotype they are. So There's residents who eat fish, transients eat marine mammals and fish, and then there's offshore orcas. And so you have a whole mix of all those different ecotypes in there, plus the hybrids that are captive born, and they're all just fed the same standard dead fish from a bucket. So not much enrichment there, not even in the food that they get to eat, which is, you know, whales in the wild, they spend their whole day trying to chase down that one specific kind of fish that they love. Oh yes, and then I just wanted to mention in the wild, when they are at the surface, that's for a purpose. So, you know, they're either breathing or they'll be spy hopping, which is when they come directly out of the water, just to check out their surroundings. Tail slapping, they think that's done, it creates a really loud sound, so it could be used to stun prey or communicate to other whales in the area about a threat or anything going on. They breach, and when they breach in the wild, they could literally just be doing it because they enjoy it, not because someone told them to. Scientists believe they also might breach to get their bodies clear of any parasites or anything that are attached to them, because when they fall down, all that, you know, comes off. And then they can ride the waves of ships. You know, that's another thing they believe they strictly do because they enjoy it on their own free will. But it's also a way for them to travel really fast without expending a ton of energy. So in the wild, they can go as fast as 35 miles per hour. I don't think you could ever see that with a whale in captivity. Even at SeaWorld, where the pool is a lot longer, you know, they might get up to that speed, but by then they're at the end of the tank. So, alrighty. Sorry, let me go back. I was trying to read my Q&A, but I think I might have, I don't know if I can multitask. Okay. All right. Yeah, so it's not a wonder that captivity is physically and mentally taking a toll on these animals. They're biologically designed to swim, travel, socialize. They're orcas, killer whales, they're the top predator of the ocean. And they're also a cosmopolitan species. So they're found in every ocean on the planet. They have way more purpose than to sit in a pool and perform tricks. And aquariums strip them of every biological purpose they have, which results in such stressful and unfulfilling lives. And now I would like to talk about Tokate, or Lolita. She is the reason I decided to go to law school. And, you know, even though I haven't been able to get a job in animal law, I will always fight to try to find some way to help her. She is an endangered southern resident killer whale. These whales, there's 3 pods. They're in the Pacific Northwest. So we know who her family is. We know what pod she belongs to. She's part of the L pod, and she was born around 1966. She was captured as a baby. They believe she was about 4 years old. These captures were like the bomb that set everything off for cetacean captivity. It was in Penn Cove and Whidbey Island in Washington State. They drove a bunch of boats to go and collect these animals, and the animals actually knew what was going on. The moms and the babies separated off to try to go a different pathway so that the men on the ship wouldn't find them, while the males and the older pod members went a different way to distract them. But ultimately it didn't work. They caught up to them and they caught them. A few whales died in the process, and the rest were taken to aquariums. And Lolita is actually the last surviving member of these captures. She's resided at the Miami Seaquarium for, it'll be 51 years this August. Yeah, so her pod is actually endangered, and they're pretty much on the brink of extinction. There's a lot of people fighting for her pod to get the dams removed so that the fish that they eat can be restored and they can hopefully up their numbers. They were decimated after these captures, and they got their numbers up, but now that they have no food, it's almost impossible for them to keep going. So a lot of people are fighting for her family, and a lot of people are fighting for her on her own to get her back to her family. PETA was actually the first to really go after uh, the Miami Sea Aquarium in the court system. So they were their first plan, their first step was to get her listed as endangered, because even though she's part of that pod, and we all know that, because she was captive, she wasn't included in that listing. So PETA fought and they got her listed by the National Marine Fisheries Service. And with that, they were plotting their next step, which was to file a case against the Miami Sea Aquarium under the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act protects endangered species. It is illegal to harm these species. Harming an endangered species includes any act that actually kills or injures an endangered animal. It's a very low standard because endangered species are obviously so sensitive. Any kind of harm to them could lead to extinction. So the Endangered Species Act was designed to be applied liberally. And PETA knew this, and that's why it was important for them to get her listed as endangered, even though she's captive. So their next step was to file against the Miami Sea Aquarium for violating the Endangered Species Act. They were arguing that her captive conditions themselves injure her because, like I described, it is stressful. She's in a teeny tiny little tank. It's actually the smallest tank for orcas in America. And she's housed with no other orca. She's housed with other dolphins, Pacific white-sided dolphins, actually. Everything about her situation is harmful, but the courts didn't see it that way. So instead of just doing an analysis of harm at that very low standard, they combined it with another law, the Animal Welfare Act, which has their own standards for captivity. And they created this higher standard that, well, as long as they're meeting these minimum requirements of the Animal Welfare Act, they're not harming her. It has to be a more grave threat to her. So even though I believe her conditions even meet that criteria, the court didn't agree. It went to the 11th Circuit and they created this standard and said, no, the Miami Sea Aquarium isn't harming her. So even though her tank doesn't meet the Animal Welfare Act standards, and the Miami Sea Aquarium doesn't practice generally accepted husbandry because they pair her with non-compatible animals, they provide too small of a tank, no companionship, the court decided she was not being harmed or seriously harmed. So the court failed her, which is really sad because it really should have been an open and shut case. But I'll show you some pictures. So up here in the left, those are actually pictures of the Penn Cove captures. They have pictures of that day and you can see how they were trying to rope all the animals in. And then this picture in the center is actually a picture of Lolita with Hugo. He was also a southern resident killer whale, and he was caught a few years before the Penn Cove captures and shipped to the Miami Sea Aquarium. And he was actually in a pool that they now use for manatees. It was even smaller than this tank, which is called the whale bowl. And he actually died. I know, another gruesome picture on the right there, but he would repeatedly bash his head into the side of the tank. A lot of people believe this is because of stress. One time he actually sliced the tip of his nose off, his rostrum, and they had to surgically reattach it. And then, so he had been in there for about 10 years and he slammed his head against the wall so hard that he suffered an aneurysm. A lot of people believe he was actually committing suicide, that it was intentional. And then allegedly his body was dumped in the Miami-Dade landfill. So that's what you get. You get taken from your family, ripped away as a baby, put into the smallest tank to suffer, and then, you know, make your own choice to try to leave that situation. So it's really sad. Him and Lolita actually got along really well and they mated a few times, but there weren't any viable calves. But it wasn't enough to withstand those conditions. And then there's a picture of Lolita performing. You can see just how crazy it is, how low her tank is to the ground. There's no protection from guests, how long she is compared to the tank. That picture almost entirely shows the width of her tank. And then on the left here, this is how you can see how small her tank is, but also how it doesn't meet the Animal Welfare Act standards. So under the Animal Welfare Act, a tank has to be 48 feet across in diameter, and then at least 12 feet deep. So her tank is deeper than that. It's 20 feet deep, which is sad that that's, you know, a nice feature. And then her tank is pretty long, so it's 80 feet long, but there's this platform in the center. So going the other way, it's actually only 35 feet. I'm pointing like I'm here in person, you can see me. This platform to the wall is only 35 feet. This platform isn't removable. So that really is her swimming space, is just in that little space. The other part is just where they take her if they need to, you know, do any checkups or anything like that. You know, and she's 20 feet long. Her pool is 20 feet deep. And even then, it's only that deep in the center. So her pool kind of slopes in depth. So, you know, even around the perimeter, it's not that deep. She can't really do much. It's actually impressive that she can jump and do all the things that she does in that teeny tiny space. And then there's, I think on average, like 4 or 6 Pacific white-sided dolphins with her sharing that tank. Like you think there might be another tank in the back that she goes to when she's not in there, but that's literally it. And that's where she's been for almost 51 years. It's really sad. Yeah, and then also the worst part is that she's a killer whale from the Pacific Northwest, which is cool in a completely different environment than the very hot Miami sun. And as I explained earlier, you can see that the audience is completely shaded, but there is no shade, there's no canopy or anything for Lolita. And she is in that sun. I mean, it's completely the opposite of where she was born and where she's from and what she's probably more biologically accustomed to. So you can imagine how much more that adds to her suffering. All right, and then I'll just briefly go over the laws that are designed to protect cetaceans in captivity. So I kind of described earlier the Animal Welfare Act. That is a federal law. It's the agency that oversees it is the Animal Plant Inspection Service. Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. They enforce this for the USDA. It regulates tank size, water and food quality, and then, like I said, they set the dimensions of a tank needing to be at least 12 feet deep and then 48 feet across. And the worst part is these standards were set in the 60s when we captured all these whales. So all these rules and regulations were designed when we had no idea what we were doing with these whales. I mean, this was back then when we kept them in tiny little manatee pools and stuff. We didn't know what we were doing at all. And these standards haven't been updated, not even after everything we've learned about killer whales in the wild, what they require, what they eat, how far they travel, how far they dive, and then, you know, what we've seen of them in captivities over the last, wow, that's 60 years. You know, these requirements are completely out of date. 12 feet is the required depth, which is insane when the average orca is around 20 feet. Orcas can dive up to 500 feet. And I think the deepest pool here in America is probably around 35 feet. So they can't even really swim their body length down, maybe one body length down, and that's it, you know. And it's also under this law, it's acceptable to hold them with other species. So they can be with incompatible species that they don't share any natural history with, like all the different dolphin types. You know, and now we know that different pods speak different dialects. The Animal Welfare Act doesn't care about that. They think, oh, they're all orcas, they're fine together. So it's really sad. All this is incredibly outdated. Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service is also understaffed and underfunded, so they don't really keep up with inspections. They don't enforce codes that are not up to date, like Lolita's tank. Obviously, her tank is not acceptable, but they haven't done anything to require the Miami Sea Crane to step it up. And then discussed the Endangered Species Act that only kind of applies when the animal is actually endangered, like Lolita. And then the Marine Mammal Protection Act sounds really nice, sounds like it would do a lot for captive cetaceans, but it doesn't. It actually still allows, you're legally allowed to take orca, any cetacean from the wild, and you don't even need a good reason for it. You can literally take it to use in public display. So a lot of this is outdated. A lot of these standards need to be reset, for the bare minimum safety and comfort of these animals. And then, sorry, I'm going to wrap this up real quick. There's state laws. So really only state laws are animal cruelty laws. I haven't heard of anyone really going after any of these aquariums for cruelty. I think it'd be a great idea, especially with Lolita. They weren't able to establish that harm under the Endangered Species Act, but I think they have a good case for cruelty, especially with the evidence of brain damage caused by captivity. But state laws are actually a really great idea because the Animal Welfare Act sets a floor, but because it's a federal law, but states, they have all the power to create stricter rules. So I think going to your local government and advocating for these animals, advocating for better standards for these animals might be a really great way to make some change. And then there's the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. This is a nonprofit organization that accredits zoos and aquariums. So they like to say that they have better standards than these federal laws and everything. And if a facility chooses, they can ask to be accredited as long as they meet their higher standards. The worst part about them, though, is that they don't actually create any changes with size. And I think size of tanks is one of the most important things we need to change about these facilities. And they actually say, and I'll just read off the quote here, there are no definitive scientific data which clearly define the amount of space needed for a cetacean to be healthy. It's the quality of the space and overall pragmatic approach to good cetacean management that determines adequacy of the facility, not simply the square footage or volume of the habitat. Plus, if the cetaceans are healthy and socially adapted, then that is then what is being provided meets the standard. So the Miami Sea Aquarium actually isn't accredited by the AZA, but according to this, Lolita has survived there for 50 years. I think they would say she's adapted. So it seems like even they would find that her tiny little tank is acceptable, which is really sad. So let's move on to advocacy, which I think we are all advocates, and I think this is where we will really get any change. Like we saw in the Blackfish effect, when the public knows about all this and knows and understands how bad captivity is for these animals, we can make real change. So, SeaWorld phased out their shows for entertainment. Now they focus on natural behaviors. They were sued by stockholders because they lied about how the movie Blackfish really affected their finances. And then the best part is that the Orca Protection Act was signed into legislation in California, which banned orca captivity and breeding. So even though SeaWorld promised they wouldn't breed any more orcas, now they legally cannot breed any more orcas. They can't bring in any orcas from one of their other facilities that they, work with, and they can't capture any more orcas and bring them in. So that's really great. And Canada has also followed in line with that. But yeah, I think, we see so many people protesting for Lolita. They're out there every weekend. The Animal Legal Defense Fund and PETA, they really tried in the courtroom. They were very close, but I don't think that's going to be it. We need movements like Blackfish. We need to get the word out about these animals, especially Lolita. People were outraged at Blackfish, but if they only knew that Lolita was in the situation she's in, I think we could have another Free Willy on our hands. And then there's also the Lummi Nation. They're also thinking of bringing a suit. They're a Native American tribe, and they are trying to claim Lolita as her own because they're in the Pacific Northwest, and they consider killer whales a part of their culture and their family. So it's really great to follow them and bring attention to our case, make sure people know about them and what they're trying to do. All right, and here are some resources and pictures. This is a blessing ceremony that the Lemmy Nation held in Portland. They carved this totem of Lolita and they took it on a tour all the way down to Miami. And I think they've done that several times now, trying to bring awareness to her. So it was really amazing to witness that and be a part of that. Yeah, so there's the Orca Network. They're a great page to follow, not only their website, but on Facebook. They have so many updates on Lolita and everything going on in cetacean captivity. The Whale Sanctuary Project, ran by Dr. Lori Marino. They're trying to create permits and sanctuaries for whales to be released once we can get them out legally. They can go to a seaside sanctuary and be cared for, because they most likely won't survive on their own, but they'll be able to live and feel the ocean again. And then several other organizations, and then my email at the end if you have any questions after this that I don't answer. But yeah, thank you so much for having me and listening. Sorry, I know it's a lot of information, but yeah, if you have any questions beyond this, feel free to email me. And I guess we'll go to questions right now, if that's okay, Lou. I can't hear you.
Oops, I was muted.
Sorry.
So much, Madison, for this wonderful presentation. I think this is a very pressing animal law issue in every country. For example, in Kazakhstan, aquariums are still operating and the legislation is weak, and I would say almost non-existent.
Yeah.
And here are some questions for you. So the first question is, what tips can you give to people who want to fight for closing aquariums or seaquariums in a country where animal law is non-existent?
That's a really good question, because as you can see, even here where there are laws for animals, it's still really hard to get any attention to them and really make any changes. But like I was saying before, I think the best thing we can do is just spark public outrage, make campaigns, internet campaigns, talk to everyone. My family, I don't think they knew about Lolita until these last few years, and now they're like, out there protesting with me and everything, which is great. So just telling everybody, writing blog posts, trying to get news stations to maybe try to focus on a story on them. But yeah, I think public outreach is what we need. So any way you can get the word out on them and communicate their situation to as many people as possible.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think raising awareness is a really effective way. The
Yeah.
next question is, what do you think would be the most effective way to prevent marine mammal catch for aquarium businesses?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like you said, it's still really booming in some countries like China. I think they just opened 10 dolphinariums. They've been capturing orcas again. Russia was capturing orcas. I mean, this hasn't happened since the 70s. So it's crazy that we live in a world where that's happening and people are, they're not even questioning it. So I think, again, like highlighting that, getting those stories out, sharing the documentary Blackfish, other documentaries that maybe go over it, like The Cove. The Cove is a good one. It focuses on the dolphin captures in Japan, because it's not just like, oh, they pull them out of the ocean and it's fine. Like, it's violent, it's scary. Like, this shouldn't be happening to any animals, especially in the wild. So again, I guess, just highlighting it, getting people's attention, because when people realize how bad it is, they'll be outraged and they'll do the work for you. Like, companies will not want to continue work like that when they see how the public reacts. That actually happened in Russia. So many people were against it that they actually released the orcas and belugas that they caught, which was unprecedented.
Yeah. So another question from one of the attendees is, I'm wondering how to advocate against aquarium if I only support the idea of animal welfare.
Yeah, that's kind of hard, because I feel like if you're concerned about animal welfare, then those conditions are wrong for them. That's a good question. How to advocate against aquarium that friendly support the animal welfare. I think you can just highlight that their conditions are not animal welfare, like it is substandard. So maybe you could advocate for better facilities. You could try, like I said, I don't know where you're at or if it's possible, but to go to your local governments, maybe where those facilities are at, and try to push laws that will at least create better standards for those facilities.
Yeah, okay. Another question from Sarah Plado. She is the professor of animal behavior and welfare in China. Sarah asks, I wonder if you're following the case of the two polar bears held in the facility of a hotel in Harbin, northeast China, and if you have any suggestions on how to approach the case.
That's a good answer. I haven't. I know there's so many polar bears in captivity in horrible, horrible conditions like that don't make any sense. They're completely unnatural. Um, maybe you could find a group that supports animal welfare and try to work with them to work with the hotels and these facilities to try to encourage better conditions. Uh, you know, Again, I'm going to say public outreach, but I think maybe working with a specific organization that kind of has that pull and leverage that can go to these facilities and actually have serious conversations with these people. I think that'd be a great way to, try to change a little bit of it.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. And we have the last question. Um, are the various accreditations mandatory or voluntary? I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, that's totally voluntary. But I think a lot of facilities choose to go along with it because it makes them look better. When they can say that they're accredited and have that little stamp on their websites and everything, people feel better about going to those zoos. They believe they're better cared for animals. Um, and obviously their standards are way better than the minimum that's set by the Animal Welfare Act, but it's still not great. So, it's kind of a facade, but it is voluntary. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but the Miami Sea Aquarium actually isn't accredited. I don't know if they ever tried to get accredited and were denied, or if they just aren't interested in it, but it is totally voluntary with them. All the other federal regulations are not voluntary.
Okay, thank you so much for your questions, and thank you, Madison, for your great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.